but let's talk to Dominic from California. Sounds like you want to ask about what we think God is. Is that an accurate representation of your question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask what you personally thought, or what this idea you have of God is, so that I could help understand atheists a bit more.
Well, here's the problem, is that if you ask any number of religious people, you're going to get a different response on who God is for pretty much any one of those people. So I don't even know if there is a coherent definition of what God is, because it's so subjective to the person. So instead of addressing the question in this way, maybe I'm more curious to hear what your definition of God is, and then we can address if we accept or don't accept that particular definition.
All right. Well, first, I want to address what I think most people think God is, the God of the Bible, who is clearly a God of contradiction and hypocrisy. And what I think people have got to understand is that the God of the Bible is based on plagiarized polytheistic deities. And when I'm talking about God, I'm not talking about any of these polytheistic deities that the God of the Bible, Yahweh, Jehovah, whatever you want to call them, is based on. The actual God of creation, it's like it's the underlying force of consciousness that is all around us. So literally everything and everyone is a part of God. Kind of a way to look at it would be kind of like things in a video game or cells in your body are part of the game or part of you, but they're not the entirety of the makeup of you or the game. So God is essentially just the underlying consciousness that is everywhere.
How do we know? And how do we know there's an underlying consciousness?
Well, it's something that people do struggle with, and I'll be honest, something that I've learned is that the very language we speak of, or that we use to communicate, can't actually really describe what this consciousness is fully. All we can do is describe it to the best of our ability. So,
but how do you, other than describing it, how do you know that this exists at all?
Well, the only way to do that is to look within yourself. Know yourself, and then try to correlate the patterns that you find within yourself and how they relate to the larger picture, the world around you, the actual universe. And if you do that enough, you will come to the realization that all is consciousness. That's really the only way I can describe it, of how to come to that realization.
Richard, I want to let you get in here. I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to make sure you get to say your piece.
It sounds like an interesting panpsychism medley going on here. I just don't know how, I mean, other than looking into yourself and coming to that conclusion, I do that a lot. I look into myself and come to the conclusion that I'm 6'2" and incredibly handsome. It doesn't mean it's actually the case. So what else have you got? What kind of observations can you give me that I can do? I can see, I can point to and go, oh, I see what you mean. I see how that consciousness links. So what have you got?
Well, one thing to look at it, I think from a material perspective would be realizing that everything around us is all made of the same thing. Everything's made of atoms. Everything's made of molecules. And all these molecules and atoms were essentially forged in stars. And that's one way to realize that we are actually connected with nature in a much deeper way than we actually realize, or most people realize.
I don't think that point demonstrates that at all. No. I don't I don't see how being made of the same substances means that there's a deeper connection. Like you're drawing lines between dots that I'm not convinced need to be connected or are connected. And I don't know if it seems like I'm not ready to take that jump with you. I don't know if it's you're not ready to admit that you don't know if there is any deeper meaning or something, and you want something to be there, and so you say it. But I'm not convinced that these need to be linked, or they are, and just suggesting that we're made of the same things, therefore there's this deeper meaning or a deeper consciousness, which I'm still confused about what that even is. I don't see how that's linkable at all. So how confident are you that this kind of universal consciousness exists? What if I had to ask you to make a bet on this being true or not? What was that?
There's no doubt in my mind.
So you're 100% confident that this is true. What makes you that confident?
Understanding things like natural law and realizing that things like that simply just could not have come from randomness or nothing.
So it's your answer is because you don't see any other thing that could be possible. This has to be the one. What makes you convinced that your thought process is absolutely correct in this and that you're not missing something?
Well, similar to how laws on Earth are created, they come from a source, a mind. This corresponds with the law of mentalism, of Hermeticism, which is everything.
We don't know that, though. I'm not willing to go with you that everything has a mind or comes from a mind.
Would you agree? Would you agree with me that everything you see around you, all the buildings, for example, that those existed in someone's mind before they actually came into being, that they actually envisioned what these buildings would look like?
The object didn't exist. The idea of the object did, but those are separate entities.
In their mind.
But the object did not exist in their mind. The concept existed in their mind. The image maybe existed in their mind. But how many times have you thought of something in your mind and then tried to put it into practice and it just doesn't work? There are many things, like if I was trying to build a structure out of Lego and I imagined hey, this would be a really cool structure to build, but then I start actually making it and actually this structure is not going to stand using the structure I had in my mind. There's a disconnect sometimes between what you know and what is. And I think it's important that we don't get overly confident in our mental ability to think through those things, because there's a lot of things that I don't know, and probably the most dangerous thing is what you don't know that you don't know. And what it sounds like to me is that in this situation, you don't know what you don't know. And so you're asserting something. And it kind of, I'm curious about how you can be so convinced that you know that you're not missing something in this scenario.
Well, let's take your Lego example. Okay. It is similar to discovering the truth. That is that you have this structure idea of what you think the truth is or what you want the building to be. And then you go about actually working at it and you find that, well, this didn't work the way I thought it did, or this wasn't the way I thought it was. And then you have to work to align your perceptions, or in the case of building something, your labors, with the way that it actually is or should be.
Right. So this sounds kind of, this kind of goes against what you were saying with you being 100% confident that your perspective on this is correct. But I'm just you just said that if you go in and you start learning more and then you change your perspective based on the new information you learn. And so you didn't know something, you get more information, and then you change your mind. But that's going to impact your confidence level, right? And even going into that Lego structure, I probably wasn't 100% confident. Even if I was fairly sure it would work, I don't know if there's many things I would get to 100% confidence on. But how did you arrive at this level of confidence when, like, do you see where I'm going with this? Does it make sense? Richard, do you have
from? Was there something Richard wanted to say?
No, go ahead. I wasn't sure if he was trying to jump in.
I will in a minute. Dominic, say what you were saying. I'm just curious about something, but finish your thought. Has he gone?
What was the question?
Shall I say?
Sorry, I kind of.
Shall I say what I was saying, and we'll go for what I'm curious when I'm listening to you, Sam. Do you think the individual pieces of Lego have consciousness in this situation?
Yes. Everything or every inanimate object around you is in some way conscious, just not on the level that we are.
So we're talking panpsychism, that everything right down to the most basic atom has some level of consciousness, some level of awareness.
I've never heard it called that, but yes.
Yeah, look it up. It's very interesting. Called panpsychism. Then what is assembling the Lego? Is the Lego assembling itself, or is it an outside force assembling the Lego?
So the way I understand it, with the way God created the universe, is he thought it into existence, or it's not. God's not really a he; it has no gender. If the God thought of the universe, and it set in stone certain laws and certain ways that are just inherent and unchangeable. And these are the things that we come to discover over time and learn. And at this point in human history, many people have discovered these things, like natural law, which is one of the most important things to understand God and what God actually expects of us as human beings.
I'm still curious as to whether the Legos are assembling themselves or as an external force, because you kind of seem to be sitting on the fence and saying they're assembling themselves and it's an external force. And I want to know which it is, because either everything has a consciousness and that is God, or there is a God that brought this thing into being. And I can't see how you can mesh these two. And this is before I even object to the whole thing, which I mind in a minute. But that in there, I'm like, you've got to pick one, surely.
Well, one thing to look at it, you can look at it like the universe is essentially God having a physical experience, or spirit having a physical experience. So that from what I understand of God, is his whole purpose from us is to basically gather information, collect whatever information it needs to collect for whatever purpose that God has or planet has. I don't know that. I just assume that it's good. And it collects the information so that it can come to the conclusion of whatever its divine plan is. And it does that by experiencing its creation subjectively through us and everything around us.
All right. So how do you know any of that? How did you arrive at that whole thing?
Because I have listened to and read occultists, and the thing that the occultists say and the ancients say, to me, make more sense than what modern scientists say, or what really any
basically
has to say on this subject.
So basically what you're saying is that it made sense to you, so that's obviously the right answer. That's very, I don't know, like that sounds very overly confident to me.
It's not necessarily that it just that just made sense to me. It made more sense than everything else. And through that, through using my intellect to decipher this ideology or this belief, and what does this have to offer, and my intuition together, I was able to come to this conclusion.
So can intuition be wrong?
When you use it in a balanced way with intellect, it is a useful tool. You must balance intuition.
Can it?
Intellect.
So if you're going to balance it with intellect, what intellect did you use to balance out your intuition with regard to this? So we have this subjective portion that it makes sense to you. But if you're even saying that we need the intellectual component, what is that component? What does that look like?
Well,
for you, like what convinced you intellectually?
It was looking. Well, if you really want to get to when I first started to question things, it was when I was in my religion and they changed the Bibles. And I was like, well, why did they do that? And they basically said to dumb them down and make it easier for people to understand. And that didn't really sit right with me. And so ever since then, I've been very interested in discovering the truth. And through using and discovering methods like the trivium, I suggest you look into the trivium if you haven't. I was able to come to this conclusion, which is what I was just talking about God.
So I have a question though, because I think this is where we're stuck. Because you keep essentially going back to like this. I agree with this thing more than all of these other things. Is there a possibility that there are options outside of the options you've looked at?
Likely, but I'm quite confident that I've found people who...
So then how can we rule out the possibility? How can we say then, like, is it, like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy for this, but like...
Well, like I said, it's objectively looking at the whole picture.
But how can you look at the... But how can you look at the whole picture if you only assume that what you know is the whole picture? Like if you're looking at, like, I guess it's kind of like that analogy where you have like two blind men and they're both like petting an elephant and one person's petting the trunk and they say they're describing the trunk of the elephant and they think like, oh, this must be like a garden hose or something because of how it's thin and long and rough. And it's like you have another person that's touching like another part of the elephant and says, no, it's not thin. Like it's actually like very broad and all this stuff. You have totally different perspectives of this elephant, but neither one of them is looking at the entire elephant. So how do we know that you're looking at the entire elephant? And if you're not, how do we know that the component that you're looking at is the most important one or the one that matters or is the true perspective? Like it's a lot of confidence to say that your perspective and your study and your intuition is the right one and that it's so unlikely that you're missing any other pieces of this puzzle. I want to know what convinced you that much.
Well, look, it does require a bit of faith, and the only faith that you need to have is that we're not like these blind men. We do have...
How do you know that? How do you know, though?
I'm going to explain in a moment. We do have the tools necessary to understand what God actually wants from us, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be, have such an understanding of things like music or art or engineering. If we can understand those things, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to understand what the creator of the universe wants from us. And the way we can understand that is by understanding natural law.
Richard, it looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, I'm a little bit puzzled by this whole thing, because from what I got is that you read some old stuff and some modern sort of esoteric shamanic stuff, and it just felt nicer. You just thought that sits better.
That wasn't all I looked into.
Okay,
I just
and
wanna
what
say
did you
that.
look into? Because when you say natural law, what do you mean? Are we talking natural laws in a
I'm
Hobbesian sense of how humans ought to behave and gather, or are we talking about physics?
I'm talking about the laws that the Creator set in place that govern behavior for beings with the capacity to understand them. These
So
laws are as real as any of the physical laws. Just
there's a
like
problem with this
Yeah.
though, because you're saying that all of this is based on the natural laws, which are again unfalsifiable, because you're
Yeah.
saying the definition of the natural law is something that God came up with. How do we prove God? It sounds like we're going in a circle.
Yeah,
Because
and
if we have to use the natural law, which is God made, to then prove God,
the way we can prove that is if we go back to what I was talking about last week about how man has taken over and they think that they know what's best and they reject God's law. All we need to do is observe the effects that this has created. And quite clearly,
how can I reject a God's law that has no evidence of existing at all?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
I don't know what if I'm rejecting something, I don't know what I'm rejecting, because you haven't really presented what all of this is.
Yeah.
What is God's law? Like, can you give me some specifics? Like, I feel like a lot of this conversation is still very vague, and kind of wishy-washy. Can you tell us some specific parts of this natural law that God has made?
Natural law is just basically understanding the objective difference between right and wrong action.
That doesn't mean anything. Tell me, what is right? Give me examples or definitions of what is right and wrong. What does that mean?
Wrong actions, or I should say anything that is a right action is anything that is not a wrong action. And a wrong action is any action that causes harm onto another person. And as far as I know, there are seven wrong actions that a person can commit. And it's beyond that.
Only 7.
Anything else is theoretically, yes, anything beyond those is theoretically a right.
Okay, so what are these 7?
Yeah.
And so you're claiming that everything wrong falls into these 7. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so give me the 7.
Murder, theft, assault, rape, trespass, lying or deceit, and coercion. These are the 7 things that no one has a right to do because they directly interfere with someone else's freedom to freely express themselves in the physical universe, which is not something anyone has a right to do.
Except I can think of reasons why you might want to do all but 2 of those. A war covers most of them, especially if it's a war for the right reasons. So trespass. You're going into another person's country without their permission to try and stop them from being a tyrant and invading someone else. Murder. Well, that's kind of what you're doing there, really. Theft. You're taking often their material, using them against them. These can be argued by people, maybe not me, but by people, to be a moral right in the right circumstance. So how can there be absolute wrongs? I'm curious.
Well, one thing to understand as well is a yin and yang principle is that it's basically do no harm and take no shit. So you be prepared to not initiate harm. If you don't do any of those things, then odds are nothing bad or no harm will come to you.
So are there gray areas in any of this? Are there gray areas in any of this, Dominic?
No.
There's no gray areas with right and wrong. Is that what you are saying?
Yes. Yes. It's very clear, and if people understood this, there'd be a lot less chaos in the world. But I'm trying to explain the second principle, which is the art or the act of self-defense, which is
I don't
in the world.
Okay.
So there is a gray area, self-defense.
Yeah, that you just described a gray area.
No, if there's someone else who is initiating these wrongs that I'm talking about, then you have a right to go out and stop them. So like the Nazis, for example, they were out killing a bunch of people. Yes, you did have a right to go over there and stop them and kill people in war if it was a result on stopping them.
When these come into conflict, that I would consider that to be a gray area, is when right and wrong come into conflict with each other. And there are plenty of situations like that that I deal with on a regular basis. There are times when you have to violate somebody's autonomy, potentially. And there are cases when, well, you have minors. There's a lot of legal issues regarding minors, and because they might not want a certain medical procedure done for them, but if something is life-saving, we will often violate the autonomy of a child in order to save their life because they're not intellectually capable at that stage of making their own life or death decisions. So that's a gray area where we've said, as a society, we value the lives of children, and we're going to intervene and say that we're going to have implied consent for minors in emergency situations. With an adult, we'd have a different metric for that because adults can make that decision. So if an adult wants to say, I don't want a blood transfusion because I'm a Jehovah's Witness, they are allowed to make that decision. Whereas when it's a minor, we're less likely to let that decision go through because that borders on child abuse in that sense. So I think I don't know if I think your lack of nuance in any of this is problematic. And I think, number one, like your initial assertion saying that you are 100% confident in your viewpoint, and then now saying that there's no gray areas, I think you really need to think more about your own. Like, I think, like, this is going to sound harsh, but I think you need some self-awareness in what you don't know. I think you are overestimating what you know, and that's really scary to me. Like, I have a medical degree. I'm a resident physician, and I make a lot of decisions for people. And like, there's a lot of things that I know about the human body and how it works, but I don't think I'm ever going to be 100% confident on anything, because if I'm wrong, like, and there are cases where I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is a minor thing, and I'm pretty sure that they can go home and they're not going to die later this evening, but I don't know for sure. And so every single case, no matter how benign it seems, I have to go back and say, what am I missing? And I talk with colleagues, I talk with mentors, say, am I missing something here? Because this stuff matters. Like, having that awareness of what I don't know is so important. And I think maybe we're going to end this call here, because I would love for you to think about some of these things and come back next week and we can continue this discussion. But I really hope you'll look at why you're that confident.
I don't know. I just want to say there is a lot of things that I do know I don't know, or I don't know. But I am confident in saying that there is a creator of the universe, and that we can know or come to understand what the creator expects of us.
So bring us evidence. So next time, bring us evidence that's beyond just saying that you know because you thought about it and you know. So bring us something else that would convince me. Yeah. All right.